World Literature Lesson 33. We're in the Les Miserables section, and this will be part 2. Now we are continuing in part 4 of the book, right? And part 2 of today's lesson. I want to focus on little Gavroche, or Gavroche. For a while here, he becomes more and more important part of the story. Now remember, we have 5 Thénardier children, not counting, of course, the lark, but 5 biological children. The first 2 were the only ones the mother ever found any grace to love, and they were the 2 oldest, and they were both daughters. And Eponine was the oldest, and we've seen her, and we'll continue to see her more. Azelma was the second daughter, and they're fairly close in age, and she also, when the girls were small and before their fortunes turned worse and worse, was a recipient of the mother's love and the father's to a certain degree, and then as time went on, they were being used more and more in the bandit business, so to speak. Then they had one son, and this, the oldest son, and this was Gavroche, and he was ignored from the beginning. It says, and this is way earlier in the story, it says certain mothers have only so much love, and she had used it all up on the daughters, quote unquote. And so there was none for him, and he just sat in a cradle and was ignored. And as soon as he became, by the time he's out the old Gavroche house, he rarely lives there. Okay, there's no love at home, there's no attention at home, there's no care at home, and he becomes a child of the street. Now, there are also 2 smaller brothers that come along later, and they are sold off, so to speak, really, actually, literally sold off by the parents who have no desire for them except as they view them as a commodity that can be sold and made money off of. And so he has 2 smaller brothers, and they're sold to a lady who also is part of the criminal element. And her last name, I think I wrote it down here, is Magnon. But in the affair, where the Thénardier gang gets broken up at the Thénardier home as they're trying to scam Valjean, and everybody flees. Most of them are picked up and spend some time in prison. And she kind of gets caught up in that. She had a real minor role in that, but she gets caught up and herself goes to prison, at least for a little while. And the boys are immediately thrust out onto the street. Well, who should come by and rescue them but their older brother? Gavroche rescues them. And he takes them under his wing. He hears them crying in the night. He says, "Oh, come on. That's nonsense. You're fine. Here, I'll take you. I'll grab you something to eat, some bread, and then I'll show you where I sleep. And you come home and sleep with me." And, of course, where does he sleep? He sleeps in this large statue of an elephant that's on the square or in the park or whatever. Okay, it's kind of a little statue. Okay, not too little, big enough to climb into and to sleep in there at night to be safe. And even though it has a bunch of rats already living in there, he is. Remember, Gavroche is very streetwise, and he knows how to get along. He even does helps the the bandit element during part of the time, whatever, but he makes his way. And he takes these 2 young and scared boys. I think the youngest is 5 and the other one is a couple of years older, but they're very vulnerable here, and he takes them under his wing. And he says, "From time to time, when they were passing before a lighted shop, the smaller one stopped to look at the time by a lead watch suspended from his neck by a string." Here is decidedly a real ninny, said Gavroche. Kind of a little bit of a harsh or stern exterior, right? Then he thoughtfully muttered between his teeth, "It's all the same. If I had any mômes, any little children," again, that argot speech, "if I had any mômes, I would hug them tighter than this." In other words, he, in the midst of a hard, tough life, has compassion on these children that have been, quote unquote, carelessly mislaid. Mom has been sent away to prison. Of course, she tried to make a little bit of a provision for them, but they got thrust out on the street by accident. But there's not a great deal of care. And here we see this wonderful tenderness by a little boy who's never been shown any tenderness, at least certainly not from home. And again, does this harken back to his sister Eponine, having the ability to be tender-hearted, generous, even very unselfish with Marius. That theme, individual and society, and how these two intertwine and play or press on one another. We would maybe consider him the rough angel. He speaks a little harsh to them because he thinks sometimes when you're feeling too bad, too tough, like life is so hard you can't handle it, a little loving roughness goes a long way. Like, no need, don't be a baby, don't cry about the lightning. What's a few little rats, Of course, it's quite a bit more than that. But he's training these young ones. He's helping them. And that's a beautiful scene. He has no idea that those are his brothers. That's just a little bit of irony placed in there for us. Well, let's look again then at Eponine. It's one of the delights of the book to me that both Eponine and Gavroche become significant examples in the story from very unexpected places. I got a question for you. Have you ever met someone and your first impression of them, they became what you were not expecting by first blush, a very significant example in your life from an unexpected source, an unexpected place? I have had that experience more than once, and it has humbled me. Somebody I thought, would not maybe have that much to offer. You see, I'm being vulnerable here. I'm showing you sometimes my own weaknesses, that I could sit and judge anybody and think that they might not have something great to offer me. But sometimes we do sometimes judge each other. That's the point. We make quick impressions. We all do. We're all guilty of it. Some have learned to be less guilty of it than others. But there's not a one who's never done that, I don't think. But I have done that in my life. And then to come and realize, my goodness, this person is amazing. This person shows a lot more maturity, godliness, compassion, generosity, affection. You plug in selflessness than I do. And always that draws me to my knees. And Eponine and Gavroche are growing in this same thing as far as it being revealed to the reader as this book goes on. And I think they're designed, that's very purposeful. They're designed to show us that, to bring us to humility, to remind us, of the noble hearts that are out there. And they can't always be seen by us. We have to be careful, not by the packaging. Can we judge that, right? But we shouldn't be judging it at all. Our perspective is so small. But anyway, so Eponine rescues, very heroic, as she rescues Cosette and Toussaint, the housekeeper, from the bandits by diverting the bandits, including her father, that are getting ready to rob the house and probably be violent. Speaking of the choices we made, one more example of the coldness of her father is, now partly you got to understand, she's doing this to distract them from robbing the house. But Eponine began to laugh, it says, and sprang to his neck. I am here, my darling father, because I am here. Is there any law against sitting upon the stones in these days? It is you who shouldn't be here. What are you coming here for, since it is a biscuit? I told Meg no. So, in other words, house is not worthy of robbing. There is nothing to do here. But embrace me now, my dear good father. What a long time since I have seen you. You are out then, meaning out of prison? Now remember, he hasn't seen her for months. He's been in prison. And his only response? Thénardier tried to free himself from Eponine's arms and muttered, Oh, very well, you've embraced me. Yes, I am out. I am not in. Now, be off. The hardness of his heart, which, remember, our hearts do not stay static. They grow in one direction or another. In contrast, she is brave and selfless and is willing to suffer, even to keep Cosette and the housekeeper safe. Now, Marius learns in the garden. He comes in and sees that Cosette is crying and learns that Valjean plans on taking her away to England. He has no money. She has no money. Okay. He doesn't know. He's in despair. He doesn't know what to do about it. And then he thinks, wait, I'll go to my grandfather. I haven't seen him for 4 years, but I'll go to my grandfather and beg for his blessing on this marriage, that I could have my inheritance and be able to support my wife. Then when we come to the meeting with his grandfather, Gavroche and himself, now remember, the grandfather has been suffering all this time too, in quiet. He feels the wrench of not having his grandson's affections and presence, which he does love his grandson, but he is having a very, very difficult, he's proud, he's having a very difficult time breaking enough to say what he's really feeling. And this, you see this often. This is not an uncommon scene in life. People who cannot move past their hurt, their own offense, to break out and say. So their hearts break out of the mold and declare what they're really feeling. So their hearts are broken. Their hearts are breaking. It's not that they're just cold and resistant, but in their own pain, they cannot take the step out to express what they're trying to express to the other. And so we see this between Marius and Guillet Normand, his grandfather. There's that name again for you. So on 598, it says, and the old man resumed in an angry and stern voice. Come now, what do you want of me? Monsieur, said Marius, I know that my presence is displeasing to you, but I come only to ask one thing of you, and then I would go immediately away. And so here they're missing each other already, You are a fool, said the old man. Who's telling you to go away? This was the translation of those loving words which he had deep in his heart. Come, ask my pardon now. One thing going on the inside, coming out all wrong. Throw yourself on my neck, was what he's thinking. Guillet Normand felt that Marius was going to leave him in a few moments, that his unkind reception repelled him, that his harshness was driving him away. He said all this to himself, and his anguish increased, and as his anguish immediately turned into anger, his harshness augmented. So rather than being softer, the next thing that comes out of his mouth is harder. How ironic, isn't it? We really don't do relationships well all that often. This is a common trouble with people. He says he would have had Marius comprehend, and Marius did not comprehend, which rendered the good man furious. How ironic. right? So the breach is greater, though both their hearts want to reconcile. Sad, isn't it? We're needy people, I read this and I think, boy, we need God. Okay, this is just such a common common event in life, where your heart is in one place, but you cannot get it out. Often our pride, often just we're choked in our own sorrow. It can go on. And then he says a word that somehow reconciles them for the moment. He calls him Father, and he says, come, come in, tell me all about this young love. And then he kind of laughs at him. He views him as young and foolish. And he says, well, don't marry her. We all had little affairs like that. No. And of course, remember, the grandfather's a frivolous old man. He's trite. He's all about his own pleasure. Much about, not concerning his grandson, but much of him is about pleasurable, maybe we'd call a decadent lifestyle. And that has always offended his grandson, who's very serious and reflective in nature. And then he makes light of his love. Now you got to think, this is the one and only love of Marius's young life. He's never felt this for any other. He holds her on a pedestal. He reveres her. He adores her. And so for his grandfather to say some callous remark like, well, no, don't marry her for pity's sake. Just make her your mistress. And that is deeply offensive. And boy, that is the line that just, if we were making any progress, we're not making it now. On page 602, in this same scene, Marius picks it up. He's horrified. 5 years ago, you outraged my father. Today, you have outraged my wife. Now, he's not married yet, but the one he intends to marry. I ask nothing more of you, monsieur. Adieu. And boy, that's it. He walks out. His grandfather knows, I'll never see him again. And he all but faints. And I wrote down in my notes, how can we miss each other so easily in relationships? It's sad to me because it happens. It's happened to me so many times in my life. How do we miss each other when our heart can be feeling something, and the way it comes out, or the way the other person perceives it, or the way they treat you, and you both live in your own, so to speak, corners, and you're broken. And I wrote in my notes, we have a desperate need for God's help in relationships. In relationships, yes, to him, to be reconciled to him, but also to be able to build honest, healthy, wholesome relationships with one another. Okay, so she says, there was no letter, so Cosette must not love me, is Marius's conclusion. And just at that time, Eponine arrives. She yells at him. She's dressed as a young working man. She yells, your friends expect you at the barricade. So I've circled these two things in red because these are both fabrications of Eponine. because of her love for Marius, it seems kind of crazy that her love would tell him to go to the barricade, because really she's thinking he will die there, but she plans on dying there. Life is too rough, and her love for him is unrequited. She wants them out of the way for the same motive. Now we're going to talk a little bit next about the preparations for revolution. Let's catch up a little bit of background here for you. A few details I don't want you to lose. The first one is that the street on which the revolution takes place, this little skirmish, so to speak, not little in the lives of the people who are involved in it, okay? Like a riot in the street, so to speak, a sputter of a revolution. The street is named Rue Saint-Denis. It's not the biggest action that goes on that night, but it is the one the author is focusing on. The tavern where they build the barricade is called the Corinth. These are good little details to know. Enjolras is he's the revolutionary spirit. He's the one who leads. He's kind of the leader of the revolutionaries of this little group that Friends of the ABC, only one of the little groups that's involved in the revolution of this month, the July Revolution. Let's go to 6:18. Okay, all these revolutionary friends are together. This is the same group that Marius had gotten to know for a little while previously. They become drunk. The next morning they'll build that barricade, so they're in anticipation here of this is it. This is the day. The revolution is beginning. Grantaire, and we've seen him before. We've been introduced to him. He loves and admires Enjolras. Laments that the latter, the fiery revolutionary heart of their conspiratorial group, despises him. Now, this is the man who cares nothing about the revolution, but he hangs out with this group because he so admires. This guy Enjolras is like his opposite. He so admires his courage, his direction, the principles by which he lives, all that stuff, and Enjolras, despises him. Okay. But he still hangs by him, real close. Now, this is important because in a couple more pages, Grantaire, in 621, he's waking. This is now the next morning. He's got a bad hangover. He feels miserable, and all the scurrying's going on about them as they're destroying and gathering up the cushions and the mattresses, destroying the furniture, putting a big pile in front of the tavern from which to take their stand. Okay, and Grantaire, cried he, this is Enjolras, go sleep yourself sober away from here. This is the place for intoxication and not for drunkenness. In other words, we're intoxicated upon a cause. Get out of here with your drunkenness. Do not dishonor the barricade. This angry speech produced upon Grantaire a singular effect. When we say a singular effect, it means a marked effect, something very sobering, poignant, sharply different than what had been going on before. One would have said that he had received a glass of cold water in his face. He appeared suddenly sobered. He sat down, leaned upon a table near the window, looked at Enjolras with an inexpressible gentleness, and said to him, let me sleep here. Go sleep elsewhere, cried Enjolras. But Grantaire, keeping his tender and troubled eyes fixed upon him, answered, let me sleep here until I die here. Enjolras regarded him with a disdainful eye. Grantaire, you are incapable of belief, of thought, of will, of life, and of death. In other words, you're not going to die for a cause. Give me a break. You don't stand for anything. Grantaire answered gravely, that means seriously, you'll see. We call this foreshadowing. In other words, in that simple statement, it makes us think what? It hints that there might be more to Grantaire than we think. Right? We call that foreshadowing. It's giving us a hint before. Don't miss this. watch out for Grantaire. Keep your eye on this character. I wrote that this section is a very small microcosm of the brief revolution. There's only 30 cartridges given out to each. It was a hopeless cause. It's almost remind you of an Alamo, last stand here. A hopeless cause, but their hearts are in it because they believe in liberty. They want to go further in the revolution of ideas. Have you ever thought of that? Why do we fight for hopeless causes? Well, actually, Hugo thinks a lot about it. And he takes it up on 626. And he actually has quite an extensive, it says 50 men waiting 60,000. And he goes on and he explains, tries to develop that a little bit on what would motivate us to fight. He has sections of that, some of which are actually ripped out of the abridged version. You have to take out some things where he even develops this idea more. But here it says 50 men versus 60,000. That is a hopeless cause. Okay. So why would you just not put your arms down and forget it? Right? And yet every hopeless cause, how many millions do you think have been fought during the course of the decades, generations, centuries, millennium? Well, the next thing we want to think about is a spy goes into their midst. Somebody comes in, sits down at the table, and just starts watching what's going on. And finally, it's Gavroche, who recognizes him as, he calls him a spy, he is a policeman. He warns Enjolras, who is their leader, and Enjolras says he will be shot 10 minutes before the barricade is taken. Why not shoot him now, immediately? And the answer is simple: they cannot afford the ammunition. So we left Marius, and he had been given that message by the young man, quote unquote, in the street, who's really Eponine. He thought he'd kind of recognize the voice, that raspy, deep voice that he doesn't expect from a young lady, but he's in despair at this point, and he wanders his way to the barricade. And he has this great conflict. He believes at this point that Cosette does not love him, that they've gone away to England, that it would be impossible to ever find her again, and that she has his address and yet never wrote him as they had agreed upon. So obviously he's got nothing to live for. He might as well die. He'll go and fight with his friends. But he has this internal struggle over whether or not it's right after his father was a great war hero at the Battle of Waterloo. What would it be for him to work in a hopeless cause again, this idea of the hopeless cause in a revolution? And finally he comes, and I told you that the author takes us through some reasoning over the why. Why would we have this hopeless cause, or this desire to work or live or help in a hopeless cause? And so it shows back and forth how he brings himself to determination in that regard. Page 633 is where that kind of comes to a head, and he finds the nobleness of what he's doing. So he says, suddenly he straightened up. A sort of splendid rectification was wrought in his spirit. There was an expansion of thought fitted to the confinity, or the confines, of the tomb. To be near death makes us see the truth, the vision of the act upon which he felt himself, perhaps on the point of entering, appeared to him no longer lamentable, but superb. The war of the street was suddenly transfigured by some indescribable interior travail of the soul before the eye of his mind. All the tumultuous interrogation points of his reverie, in other words, where he's asking questions back and so forth to his mind on whether this is noble, right, a waste, whatever, before the eyes of his mind, all the, thronged upon him, but without troubling him. He left none without an answer. So he finds himself all in to the cause, so to speak, fully committed, not any time too soon, because we have the first skirmish upon us. It's Gavroche that enters and announces it. He takes Javert's musket because he's been unarmed up to this point. So the first skirmish, and several people fall, but 2 are able to be saved by Marius's very first actions. As he comes, he has Javert's 2 pistols that had been given him for the Thénardier event that had never been given back here. And he comes in with 1 pistol. He shoots the man who is standing over Courfeyrac, and another with the other one, he rescues Gavroche, which has a man right upon him getting ready to slice him down, and Gavroche had tried to fire his musket, but it was unloaded. With his heroism, the barricade is saved for the night. It's getting late now. Everybody retreats back to the corners, and they know that they will come upon them in force once the morning comes. He asks who is the chief, and Gavroche, who up till this point has been acting as their leader, says, "You are." So Marius becomes their new leader. Now, before he goes down and threatens to blow up the powder keg on his way down, after he has shot to rescue Gavroche, he sees out of the corner of his eye somebody getting ready to shoot at him. And then a hand goes up and deflects the bullet with the hand, okay, or the musket ball. So who was that person that put their hand up and rescued and caused the musket ball to stop by taking the shot through their own hand? That was none other than Eponine. So remember, we're keeping our eye on Gavroche and Eponine, who are both becoming more and more noble with every section of this story. And so she saves Marius. She saves his life. Now, is it a mixed nobility? Sure it is. Most nobility is, by the way. Well, he comes upon her as she is dying, because not only did she save him from that musket ball by putting her hand up, and the shot went through her hand, but she was holding that hand in front of her body in such a way it also went into her body, or deflected into her body. And so she is dying, and there's no way to save her. So let's look at that tender scene on page 644. Before she dies, she confesses that she had kept a letter from him. She had the letter from Cosette that she was supposed to deliver to him, but refused to, again, because of all this conflict of emotion, as she's jealous over this young and beautiful woman that plays a role or has a love that she would never hope to have. And yet she loves Marius as well. So on the next page, or the bottom of that previous page, 644, it says, "Take it," she said. Marius took the letter. She made a sign of satisfaction and of content. "Now for my pains, promise me." And she hesitated. "What?" asked Marius. "Promise me." "I promise you." "Promise to kiss me on the forehead when I am dead. I shall feel it." She let her head fall back upon Marius's knees, and her eyelids closed. He thought that poor soul had gone. Eponine lay motionless, but just when Marius supposed her forever asleep, she slowly opened her eyes in the gloomy deepness of death, in which the gloomy deepness of death appeared, and said to him with an accent, the sweetness of which already seemed to come from another world. And then, do you know, Monsieur Marius? Or Marius, I'm sorry. Do you know, Monsieur Marius? I believe I was a little in love with you. She essayed to smile again, meaning she tried. She attempted it and expired. I believe I was a little in love, very tender, and that he's sitting there with her. He won't leave her. He knows she died for him, sacrificed herself. And he shows compassion, doesn't he? Because you see, the more we experience suffering in our lives, and Marius at this point has experienced much already, the more we experience suffering, the more compassion we learn. The scripture puts it this way. It's a common understanding. People recognize this. They can see this. But the scripture says it, turn around and comfort others with the same comfort with which you've been comforted. In other words, we all need comfort. We're all very needy at times in our lives. And as we experience suffering and ourselves press through that and find our comfort, especially in the Lord, that's kind of the context of that passage, then we can turn around and show compassion and comfort to others. And that's just a beautiful and very tender scene. These tender scenes which are surprising us from Eponine and Gavroche. So we've almost wrapped up this whole section. Let's get a last few details in here. Marius knows now that Cosette loves him, but he is stuck here at the barricade. Probably no chance to get out. Of course, they're surrounded by the soldiers who are just waiting for morning, but also he has really fully committed himself to this revolution at this point. But he is thrilled to know that Cosette does love him, and he feels he has two duties that remain because death is certain on the morrow. And so he will inform Cosette of his death, and he will save Gavroche, whom he knows is Thénardier's son, and he does have that debt from his father hopeful to repay to the Thénardier family, and he knows that Gavroche is also Eponine's brother. Okay, so he prepares the letter. He also writes another note that he puts in his own jacket pocket, and that says if they should take his body to his grandfather's home, Monsieur Gillet-Normand, and gives the address. Okay, but these are his two duties. Now he feels he can perform these two duties in one fell swoop because he will have Gavroche deliver the letter, and therefore Gavroche will be out of the line of fire. But Gavroche is really disturbed by this because, of course, he doesn't want to be out of the fire. He wants to be right in the middle of it. Okay, but he finally figures, okay, if I go right now and I run all the way and I run back, I'll be here in time. So Gavroche decides to go and do the favor. And of course, he believes he owes Marius this favor because Marius had saved his life. Now, meanwhile, at Valjean, they're at the Rue Plumet. I misspoke. They have moved from there. Okay. And of course, that's why he was in despair, because she hadn't written the letter. But they haven't moved to England yet. They are in one of his last house, the other house, the Rue de l'Homme Armé. And he's got the family settled. They've moved with just very, very little. And he's got them settled in, resting for the night. That would be Cosette and Toussaint, the housekeeper and their helper. And he's looking in the room, kind of settling down, feeling content and peaceful that, yes, he has got her safe and they'll be in England, and he's relieved, and he's not worried at all about the revolution or anything that's happening around him. He just wants to keep Cosette, who is his whole world, close to him and safe. Okay. And so as he's doing that, he glances over at the mirror, and she had, back then the ink, they used loose ink, and it was, they dipped the quill pen, of course, something like that, in the ink, and then you needed to blot it with a blotter. To dry that ink, you couldn't wrap it up right away, or fold it over. Everything would smear. So it's not like our pens today, unless you, of course, write with a ink pen like that. Okay, and with an inkwell. And so on the blotter, it leaves a mark of the printing, and that blotter is angled up in such a way, or the sheet that she used to blot that paper on is angled up in such a way that he can read these words on the mirror, which are the words where Cosette is telling Marius. It was the letter that Eponine had failed to deliver in a timely fashion that tells Marius where they are. Please come quickly before they leave the country. Okay, so Valjean sees the note, or sees the note reflected from the bladder into the mirror. From the blotter, sees the note reflected. On page 654, it says, for of all the tortures which he had undergone, and that this is speaking about Valjean, in that prolonged inquisition of destiny, this was the most fearsome. Never had such pincers seized him. This is when he finds the letter and realizes she has given somebody else the news. He has already lost her. She loves somebody. She's been in communication with them. Their life is not hidden, and it is not just his own. He felt the mysterious quiver of every latent sensibility. Alas, the supreme ordeal. All his other testings have led up to this one. The supreme ordeal, let us say rather the only ordeal, is the loss of the beloved being. So when you love somebody, and to lose them is probably the most challenging ordeal. That's at least the point here. He goes on to the top of the next page. She is going out of me. Okay, he senses with this discovery of this letter, he has lost her. Okay. The grief which he felt surpassed the possible, to have done all that he had done, to come to this, and what? To be nothing. Then, as we have just said, he felt from head to foot a shudder of revolt. No, is what his heart is screaming. No, I refuse to yield to this. He felt even to the roots of his hair the immense awakening of selfishness. He moves to selfishness, from being threatened to no, I will not have it. He goes on and he says, and the capital M, me, and the me howled out in the abyss of his soul. Boy, I understand what that means. Do you? To have the me screaming in you. I won't have this. I won't yield to this. Our self cries out. We want to preserve our happiness. We want to preserve our soul. We want to preserve our life, etc., etc. You want to keep hold of your love. And it's so hard. This is a real dying to self. This is a tremendous moment in the book. I would say all the other trials of his life had led him forth to this. What are we doing? From glory to glory to glory. And I wouldn't say that each step becomes easier. In many ways, each step becomes harder. Okay. We learn to die to ourselves and live to God. Okay. So then he continues, and he says, after he had fully determined that that young man was at the bottom of this state of affairs and that it all came from him, he, Jean Valjean, the regenerated man, he's a believer, he's a Christian, he's trying to live a godly life, the man who had labored so much upon his soul to grow in godliness, the man who had made so many efforts to resolve all life, all misery, and all misfortune into love. He's tried to respond to every kind of misfortune, abuse, offense by others with a response of love, like Christ our Savior has shown us. He looked within himself, and there he saw a specter: hatred. At this point, he intercepts the letter from Gavroche with kind of an instinct to know what was going on. He intercepts the letter that was meant for Cosette from Marius that reveals he's at the barricade and will most likely certain that tomorrow he will be dead. But he declares his love, and Jean Valjean, rather than giving that letter directly to her, she's asleep, he opens it and reads it. Now, once Jean Valjean reads the letter and he recognizes that Marius indeed will die, most likely, almost certainly, die at the barricade that next day, his first reaction is he's ecstatic. There's great joy. Why? His great adversary, the one he hates, will die, and he doesn't even have to go kill him. He will die. Marius will die. He will be rid of the rival, and he will live happily ever after with Cosette, and nobody would threaten their love. And he doesn't want to disappear into oblivion in Cosette's affections as she loves another, and he's deeply, deeply threatened by this. So Marius will die, and he is ecstatic. And so he's thrilled with this. He says, great, boy, how could that have worked out any better? My adversary will die. It's not by my hand. I could even say God took care of it. Does this remind you of some other conflicts? Petit Gervais? Champmathieu? Doesn't it remind you? Right? These deep conflicts of the soul. Now watch. It says, I love this phrase. It says, he would then find himself once more alone with Cosette. Rivalry ceased. The future began again. He had only to keep the note in his pocket. Cosette would never know what had become of, quote unquote, that man. If I have only to let things take their course. But that's exactly what we heard in the heart when the heart is in great turmoil. Moral turmoil is what this is called. Where we are in conflict over what to do. And so this definitely reminds us of the Champmathieu affair. And he says that man cannot escape. If he is not dead yet, it is certain that he will die. What happiness. And then we see in that next line a technique that is such a friend to an author, that poignant understatement. And he says, all this said within himself, he became gloomy. Why did he become gloomy? Because he knew he was wrong. He knew that is not the choice he could have. Now, it might feel as that we've made a great detour from godliness, but that's not the case. This was the supreme trial so far in the book, and he has made the right choice. Does he have conflict over it? Absolutely. Does he almost make a wrong choice? Absolutely. But he does continue. That's how we grow in godliness. The trials become greater and our choices become true. Okay, we're true to what is right and what is noble. I wrote it this way: to be godly is not the lack of temptation, but growing in the ability to choose the way that is right and noble. It almost reminds you of a Garden of Eden experience. And so with that, he puts on his old National Guard uniform so he can move about in a night like this where revolution is in the streets, and he heads off towards the barricade. And that's the end of the section.